WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM's Master of Business Administration is designed to accommodate the career needs of professionals across a variety of work organizations. More information at business.udmercy.edu.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham, and this week we're joined by Robin Vincent of Chalk Beat Detroit. Robin, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us this week on the Metro.
Tia, it's really a pleasure. I'm a fan of the show,
Yay.
A big believer of WDET. Today on the program, 50 years ago this month, the Supreme Court ruled against a desegregation plan for Detroit and suburban schools. The result has been continued segregation here in Metro Detroit. We'll talk about that ruling and its consequences with a local journalist and historian.
Really looking forward to that conversation later this hour. But first up on the show in 2023, Detroit opened a new office devoted to urban agriculture. And if you ever worked in a garden, you may be asking why these are important in the first place. The city believes gardeners are on the front lines of many things. Things like rehabilitating soil, often soaked in toxins from old auto plants, things like removing blight, or simply creating positive social interactions by rooting oneself in the food they grow. Longtime urban gardener Tepfira Rushton had been leading these projects, but she recently became the head of the city's Office of Sustainability. To fill the gap, Patrice Brown was made the Associate Director for Detroit's Office of Urban Agriculture just last week. Brown has served as a Food Access Coordinator at the Eastern Market Corporation, and now she's here to discuss her new role. Director Brown, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here and a pleasure.
Awesome. And I always ask those who are from the city, what part?
Am I from? East Side. I'm an East Sider all day.
I always ask the Detroiters that. What part are you from? So Director Brown, you've worked with local farmers and retailers as Food Access Coordinator at the Eastern Market Corporation. Talk about why local farmers and retailers are so important.
So, I spent 9 years at the Eastern Market, a historical market in the city of Detroit. The reason why retailers are so important is because it boosts the economic benefit for farmers. We a lot of times don't think about where our food is coming from. This connection is happening in the Eastern Market and around the city of Detroit in our Detroit community market spaces, which are smaller farmers markets throughout the city. I encourage folks to shop local every year. So economically, it's a really good thing. Educationally, it's a good thing to nourish yourself about what's happening and what's growing seasonally. And so we encourage that in that process.
And just being in the role for 9 years and just kind of experiencing, like you said, just being in that middle space, that middle ground where you're seeing the food coming from the gardens into this commerce space. Mm-hmm. What have you seen in terms of more of urban agriculture and normal people like me just starting up gardens and starting up their own local businesses? What have you seen in that 9 years?
So recently, we've seen a lot of farmers who want to scale from the urban ag spaces to wholesale. And so in my last few years at the Eastern Market, that's what I did. I helped local farmers who were looking to scale to the wholesale level. I created a pathway for that. And so with the help of our colleagues at Eastern Market and the leadership of Dan Carmody, we did a lot of things for farmers, and they're still happening right now. So that USDA LFPA program, which is a local food purchasing assistance program, those farmers are helping get their food into the food system through a food box program. And so things like that is very helpful to get those farmers scaled up as they see fit. And those who want to just continue to serve local, they have vendor options. So I've seen people really connect with their food through these mechanisms. And so helping our farmers get their food into the food system this way is very integral to my job right now, even still today.
That is amazing. So like you just said, you your role was to make it easier for people to start urban farms and easier to get their food into the hands of other people. Why is urban farming so important, especially when we think about the city of Detroit? I just often always go back to, especially when we're talking about the city and the history of the city and where people came from. A great migration. My family came from Arkansas. They were farmers, and they brought a farm up here with them and had chickens and everything. So why is it so important that we do pay attention to urban farming in the city of Detroit?
Absolutely. My family, too, was migrating from Tennessee at that time, and they brought farming with them on the west side of Michigan. Nice. And so my mom often talked about, rest in peace, Mama. She often talked about having pigs on the farm and collard greens, slick leaf collard greens. I don't know if people are familiar with that term, but the reason why food is so important locally is because of food security and food sovereignty. We hear Baba Malik from D-Town Farms talk about this often, and we need to learn how to grow our own food in some cases. We might not grow everything, but we might grow things that are our favorite vegetables or fruits. We have a robust set of varieties of vegetables and fruits that come out of the city of Detroit. And I think we need to tap back into the things that we learned as young folks. My grandmother preserved cabbage and called it cha-cha. It was a mixture of cabbage and bell peppers and onions, and it fermented in a jar. And those things are very key to what I'm doing with my family and community now. And so it's food security and food sovereignty for me. Those are why urban farming is important.
Yeah, right now we are chatting with Patrice Brown, the Associate Director for Detroit's Office of Urban Agriculture, who just became the leader of the department just last week. I know, snap 3 times.
All snapping in here.
So we did actually chat with your predecessor, Tefira Rushton, who's on the show. She gave us a great conversation just to talk about farming and why it's important. And she did have this to say back in October of 2023.
I'm in the food movement because I think that it is something that we need to remember how to do, grow food. We need to pass those skills on to our children and our grandchildren and that way of life. Mm-hmm. We're very separated from that right now, Steve. We're in these cities. We're very disconnected from where our food comes from, what it looks like when it's growing out of the ground. That's scary when you think about it.
You just snapped a little bit too, Patrice, because, I mean, that was actually Tefira Rushton speaking with WDET's Stephen Henderson just last year, October of 2023. But just hearing what she had to say, why is it important for Detroiters and Michiganders to be connected to the land? We just talked about it a little bit, great migration. It's kind of in a lot of our bloods already to have that farming mentality in our brain. So why has it been so hard for us to reconnect?
I think people are just used to fast food. Mm-hmm. They're used to having things very quickly. And we live in a economy right now that's very quick, and our attention spans are short. I'm raising young adults in my house who can't really pick up things, the things that I want them to learn anyway, because they're so into the tablet or the phone, distracted from what's out in nature. So I think it's a good balance of things that we need to do in our community is to reinsert them into nature. A lot of nature-based programs, that's where Tefira and I kind of link up, is nature-based programs. And so getting out in nature, learning about what's happening in our ecosystem, learning about the soil health and how nutrient-dense our food is if we source local. So those things are very important and integral to learning and educating ourselves about food. And so I also want to mention that I am the chair of the Detroit Food Policy Council. A lot of what we do there is educational based. We educate people on different food policies that's happening in the city, and we connect them to their food in ways that they might not have been thinking about. And so we connect them with the food worker, we connect them with the farmer, we connect them with that policy person, Maybe it's a water warrior in the community that's doing work. And so we make those connections in these food spaces. And so I think it's important that we spend some time to educate our youth and young adults and just adults, period. And like Tafira said, reconnect them with what they're probably used to anyway, growing up, just tapping back into that. When I lost my mother in 2019, I got my hands in the soil, and I remembered how much time me and my mother spent in the garden space when I was a young kid. So it takes some time, but we have time, I think, to help educate our community. Nothing is more important than us eating, right? We have to eat every day. I saw you eating this morning.
Oh, yeah, I was running through eating some macaroni.
Macaroni and cheese is a historic dish in our community, and I was loving seeing you eat that for breakfast. But it's things like that kind of helps us tap back into what is important to us, and I think there will be several unique ways that this happens in our community, and I'm here for every moment. And I'm happy to serve the community in this way.
Which is once again an amazing position to have opened up in the city of Detroit in general, something that a lot of us we don't think about often. We don't think about urban farming or agriculture, especially when you're in a city space. And like you said, we're growing up with fast life and fast food and fast everything, that we just don't take time to step back and just really take stock in what's happening around us. But I want to hold on to the food access part of your job for just a little bit. Mm-hmm. There are many spaces around the city that don't have access to good quality foods. That's really a big problem. Yeah. How do you intend to change that, or how do you see that changing as you're the director?
Yeah, one of the things I did while I was at Eastern Market for those years was to help create additional food access points. Eastern Market has a robust farm stand program. I started there in 2015 as a food and health fellow. And we would take roadside stands or pop-up mobile markets out to the community. What I did in my later years while at Eastern Market was to help connect farmers to what a roadside stand really was. And so this is something that I'm really interested in and want to continue to do, is connect farmers and their ability to set up a roadside vendor stand right outside of their farm, because a lot of our farms, if you think about it, are tucked into neighborhoods. And so if we connect those roadside stands with food assistant currencies like SNAP and Double Up Food Bucks and WIC, Project Fresh, and Senior Market Fresh Dollars, these are all food assistant currencies that people can spend at farmers markets and direct with the farmer. And so it's my goal to help create food hubs, roadside stands, continue to do that work in the city, and really help bring that access to the neighborhoods authentically. I think this is a thing that we need to adopt. The city, I'm hoping that they will look at some of these programs and want to continue to invest in them with me. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's already happening. We just need to look and study them and really research how we want to invest in these programs.
Just hearing you say that, and once again, driving through those neighborhoods and seeing those community gardens pop up all over the place, and wondering, number one, how do I get access to the food that they're growing over there? But then number two, in what way did they feel the need to pop this up in this particular location, in this space? So I'm always just curious about why they do it in their communities in the first place. Yeah. But just continuing on the conversation, gardeners are, like we said, often the front line of a few things that are happening, whether it's rehabilitating the soil, removing blight. Like I've seen, once again, in the Warrendale community, I've seen these urban gardens popping up in spaces that were vacant lots, and they were eyesores. And now it's like beautiful scapes and butterflies and
an oasis.
Yes. Like everything's returning, and it's really, really beautiful to see. So, what are all of the possible benefits that come from people developing these urban gardens?
One big thing is we change the trajectory of the people living in these neighborhoods. We create an environment that is safe for people to walk in that space. Work and live in that space if they desire to do so. Some people don't want to come out of their neighborhoods. And so one of the big things that I've looked at in my research, I served on the governor's Food Security Council at the top of the pandemic for 2 years. And what the numbers were out of that is there are a lot of people in our state that are full-time workers and experiencing food insecurity. How could that be? Our health is very integral and connected to what our neighborhoods look like. We have zip codes that define how long we can live. And I want to change that by let's create beautiful green spaces, not just food gardens, because everybody don't want to grow food, but it could be a pollinator garden that attracts bees and birds, different kind of birds and butterflies, like you're saying. We want to create beautiful oases, a greener city, so that we can change the trajectory of the livelihoods of Detroiters in our city. And so that is what attracted me to this role. I'm so grateful for that experience, to know that I can help change the trajectory now in the role that I serve. And so I want to change the health outcomes, because food can be looked at as medicine. Food can heal our bodies, and food can really bring us together as a community to talk about those hard issues. We're in a really heated environment right now. Our United States and the world is going through some crazy times right now, or arduous times, I'll say that. But I think what grounds us is how we create green spaces in our community and how we change the environment and really lift up the fact that we could, at this moment, change how health outcomes look in the city of Detroit. We all know the numbers from the pandemic of how sick and malnourished our city is. And so that's what I want to do with food. And through food, we can do that. We can help economically. We can bring workforce development. All of these things are connected to the food system if you really look at it a little closer. And so these are the things that I really want to do in this role. And so I'm looking forward to that.
I love that so much. And this is literally my last question because we're running up on time. Excuse me, but I definitely want to get into just the idea of making sure that in general, Black people understand and know the history, number one, of of gardening, of farming, of being in the fields, of working for themselves and making their own economic empowerment, I guess you can say. And especially as Black women and as Black leaders, we're seeing that a lot throughout the city of Detroit with Tefira, so many other women across the city of Detroit, Black women across the city of Detroit are really giving back to this urban space, this urban agriculture space. So if we could go into the importance of having you all as leaders within this realm and pushing it forward, I mean, that's just the way we would love to end it.
Absolutely. I think I'm more encouraged today than I was before I started the role, because Tefira is now over the Office of Sustainability. Let's think about what that means. Climate change, environmental impact, reducing greenhouse gases. How that relates to food is a direct correlation there. Gardens can catch that rainwater because they can soak up a lot of that water, and we can reduce greenhouse gases. And so I think we're a dynamic duo in our spaces. And so we just happen to be women leading the work. We stand on the shoulders of giants. So shout out to all of the women that's doing the work, but shout out to all of the community members and those giants and ancestors that that came before us, that laid that foundation for us. And I think we are blessed to be in this space. We both see that. Tefira and I, and so we want to continue to work, do the work that we've been doing, but like more exponential growth to that. And so I really just appreciate her and her leadership And so I'm looking forward to the work that we're going to do together in the city of Detroit.
I love it so much. You have two Detroiters leading the charge on sustainability and urban agriculture. Right now, we're chatting with Patrice Brown, the Associate Director for Detroit's Office of Urban Agriculture. Director Brown, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. We will definitely have you back on the show to talk more about everything that you're going to do in this new role.
Right on. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Coming up, a Detroit nonprofit recently received money to revitalize Detroit's Chinatown. We'll talk with the leader of that nonprofit as well as a man with roots in that area of the city.
Here with Robin Vention. You're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. And Robin, we're going to have a historical type of day today. We're learning a little bit about history and preservation and the things about the city of Detroit that maybe most people don't know.
I love that so much. I mean, history is the most fascinating subject, right? But when we can bring it home and zoom in on Detroit and its history, I mean, this is such a historically rich place, right?
It truly is. It's an amazing place to be able to report on, honestly.
Agree.
So the rich history of Chinatown in Detroit is often lost on those who aren't old enough to remember. The first Chinese immigrants began arriving in the late 1800s. By the 1930s, Detroit's Chinatown was resided just west of downtown Detroit. The corner of Peterborough and Cass now holds ghosts of the former thriving community, but a change may be coming. Recently, State Senator Stephanie Chang secured funding for the nonprofit Midtown Detroit, Inc. to revitalize the old Chinatown neighborhood. An announcement about that funding will be made today at noon in Detroit's historic Chinatown district. Here now to talk more about the plan to revitalize Detroit's Chinatown is Maureen Stapleton. Stapleton is the Interim Executive Director for Midtown Detroit, Inc. Maureen, welcome back to the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah. And also joining the show is Richard Mui. Richard is a board member of the Association of Chinese American. He teaches AP U.S. History at Canton High School and a course on Asian American history and culture. Richard, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, Richard, I had too much coffee.
It's okay.
So we're going to just jump into things. Start off with Maureen. Tell us a little bit about the money that you recently required to redevelop Chinatown. What is happening at noon at Cass and Peterborough?
We are excited to announce that through the hard work of our state senator, Stephanie Chang, along with her appropriations colleagues, Mary Kavanaugh and Sarah Anthony, we have received a one-time appropriation of $1 million. Wow. And that $1 million will allow us to begin to do infrastructure, streetscape work that brings out the heritage of the area, specifically Chinese heritage. While I wasn't born in 1930, I am a Detroiter and do remember Chinatown. And so this money will allow us to begin to infuse the culture back into the area. And it's the beginning of lots of things to come.
Indeed. And like you were saying, you were around to remember Chinatown. From your memories, what was it like?
House of Chung's was one of my favorite places to go. My family, we would get dressed up and we would go down, and it was a vibrant area, even in the 70s and the 80s. And so we at Midtown Detroit Inc., understanding the need to ensure culture, but to show a diverse culture, we're very excited to work with some community developers and others and Senator Chang to ensure that we could begin to replace or redo some of the things that have been taken away over the years to ensure that the Chinese heritage continues on in our city.
And, that's perfect segue to Richard, because I was going to ask you, Richard, what should some of those changes look like? What history should be preserved in that area?
Oh, geez. I think really it's kind of recapturing the essence of Chinatown. So there was actually a first Chinatown that was over at 3rd and Porter Street. Yeah. And then in the 60s when they built the freeway, that they destroyed that Chinatown. They tried to relocate it over here at Cass and Peterborough. It didn't entirely stick. But the hope is with this money and, the Chung's restaurant was recently purchased and they're renovating that as well, that, we kind of have some synergy here and just make it a Chinatown, a place where, people can come and Chinese Americans and Asian Americans can come back to and, find a place to gather with friends and shop and eat together here in Detroit.
And Richard, I love that you brought that particular moment in history there about the freeway and the same thing, urban sprawl, how it ruined so many communities here in the city of Detroit, especially communities of color. And,
yes.
So bringing in that particular piece of history, can you talk about the importance of that not even being omitted, but not being known as much as we know about the other communities that were displaced at that time?
Yeah, it just really does a disservice, I think, to all Americans, because if you don't know it, then you really have no connection to that past. And so what we saw during COVID was some of the anti-Asian hate, or people, they're just unaware of the history, right? And then without any visible marker for people to look at, it just, I think, further erodes. And so hopefully, if we can revitalize this Chinatown area, that'll become a beacon for others to come down here, and then then we can start talking about the history of Chinese Americans in Detroit. Yeah. And we've been here over 100 years. The first one, as you mentioned in your intro, it was about the 1920s. There's a few thousand that lived there, and then we've always been here, but just people don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And, just being a Detroiter born and raised here myself and not knowing the extent in which the Chinatown had, the importance that Chinatown had in this particular Cass Corridor area, not knowing that often just made me a little angry because it's like, why don't I know this history? So what are some things that people should know about Detroit's Chinatown that they just simply do not know?
Well, I think so. Again, the Chinese Americans have been here, and so the organization I'm a part of, Association of Chinese Americans, we actually in 1972 opened up a health clinic to service the citizens around here, and so people that didn't have access to health care, we would service them. And then later, we opened a drop-in center that we would provide citizenship classes. We would tutor English to senior citizens, and later develop the culture camp. And so it was all kind of, it was a vibrant community, I think kind of under the nose of everyone that they're unaware of. So, we existed here, unfortunately, without that centralized location. I think we've kind of gotten scattered to the suburbs, unfortunately.
Yeah. That was going to be another question as well. Do you see a presence returning? Do you see a community growing again within the city of Detroit in a way that it was thriving and lively during the 50s and 60s and 70s?
I really do, and I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the revitalization of Detroit. As I think the excitement grows about, just the renovations here in Midtown. I became associated with ACA because I came down here to tutor English to senior citizens every Sunday. So I would drive down here and, just looking here at the changes, I'm standing outside Chung's restaurant right now. Just looking at the changes, it's remarkable.
Yeah.
And driving up and down Cass, right? You see it changing. I definitely can see that as a beacon. I can see that as an attraction. I was just in Philadelphia for our national conference, and they're working to preserve that Chinatown because they're trying to build an arena on the edges there. And I think it's, I think there's a demand for it, and it's just a matter of kind of getting the seeds going and growing it.
Richard, this is Robin. I wonder if you could talk more about how something like Chinatown can offer important resources for Chinese Americans.
Yeah, so I think the big challenge, and my parents were under this situation. So when they immigrated here, right, they didn't know any English, relied on the community and the community organizations for assistance. And so my father worked in a Chinese restaurant, but I think they were able to pursue the American dream like everyone else. And that's the children were able to go to school, graduate, and pursue higher education. It's just those kind of resources, in-language resources in particular. And so that if you don't, if you're not fluent in English, if you don't know how to navigate political and economic systems, it's just a challenge. And so, part of ACA's mission is to help people pursue their hopes and dreams and do better here in America.
Right now, we're chatting with Richard Mui, a board member of the Association of Chinese Americans. Maureen Stapleton is the interim director of Midtown Detroit, Inc. And Maureen, we're bringing you back in. Why is it important for Midtown, Inc. to help preserve the character of Chinatown and continue to grow it?
As the community development organization responsible for the revitalization of 7 neighborhoods, Chinatown is the heart of one of those neighborhoods, which is our South Cass neighborhood. Many people think that Midtown is the old Cass corridor, and it really isn't. That's only 2 of our 7 neighborhoods. And so putting our stake in the ground here with the help of Senator Chang and the other senators that were supportive of this effort allow us to move the needle and make Detroit and continue to make Detroit visibly as inclusive as it is through the tapestry of all who live here. And so it was important for us to ensure that as much of the historical significance through the streetscape we can do, then that's something that's easy to accomplish with the help of finances. And very excited that we'll be able to visibly see in the year where a Chinatown was because of the things that we will be able to put on the light fixtures, the repairs that we'll be able to make to the streetscape in general.
I just want to say thank you both for being here today, chatting with us about the announcement of state funding for the preservation and beautification of Chinatown. It is happening at noon at the corner of Peterborough and Cass Avenue. And that was Maureen Stapleton, the interim director of Midtown Detroit, Inc. Maureen, thank you so much for joining us on the show, returning to the show. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then Richard Mui is a board member of the Association of Chinese Americans and a teacher at Canton High School. Richard, I want to say thank you as well for joining the show. We can't wait to have both of you back on the show and talk a little bit more about what you all are going to be doing.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Coming up, Kamala Harris's campaign is picking up a lot of steam. And now one of the questions that remains, who will be her vice presidential pick? We'll hear about the possible candidates later in the hour.
Welcome back to the Metro here on 101.9 WDET FM. I am Tia Graham, and I am here with Chalk Beat Detroit reporter Robin Vincent. Robin, it's been great having you in studio so far.
Tia, I am loving this time with you here in the studio. Thanks for having me.
Of course, but we do have a conversation. We have some things happening in the political field.
We do indeed. For the last few months, Democrats have been in a panic, right? President Joe Biden was performing really poorly. I think maybe that's an understatement, right, with voters, and it showed in the polling. But since he dropped out of the race and threw his support behind Kamala Harris, it's been a different story. Democrats are excited to make a pitch to the American people, and they now have a lot of questions to answer. One of them is, who is going to be Harris's vice presidential candidate? On the latest episode of WDET's Mishmash, is that how we say that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Host Shayna Roth and Gongwer News Services Alethea Casbin sat down with former Democratic State Representative Adam Zemke to discuss who her vice presidential Democratic nominee might be. They began this conversation exploring that question.
Harris is looking for a vice president. That's sort of the next big step for Democrats. Who is your pick, and what should Harris be looking for in a running mate?
So I think there's a lot of people who will comment on this, and I definitely, especially over the last 4 weeks, I'm going to stay away from commenting or trying to serve as a pundit, because I discovered that maybe I don't, I'm not in the same space. So I want to reserve the speculation. I'll say first of all that Vice President Harris is more than capable and smart at choosing a vice president to serve as her on the ticket with her. And I trust that she will make a smart decision on that. I think that she has had the experience that we can easily say that. And then certainly the last 72 hours just reinforces that statement. So that said, I will say there's a lot of reasons that we should be looking at the same qualifications that a lot of folks in the news are talking about, right? A Midwestern leader, somebody who supports and appeals to quote unquote Rust Belt. I hate that term, frankly, but the Rust Belt Midwest voters. I think there's a lot of examples of that. We certainly have one here in Michigan with Governor Whitmer. And there are other examples in other states across the country, too. I think we need somebody who will be able to go toe-to-toe with J.D. Vance, Senator Vance, and be able to really speak to the people that I think he proclaims to represent. Given his past literary work. But I think there are others that can probably speak to them and have those relationships as well in a more effective way. And so I think that's the type of profile we're looking at. I think that's that I think a lot of folks are looking at least. And I would agree with that profile. I think that's a good match for Vice President Harris. And will help support the ticket. There's also folks, that are not from the Midwest. We have heard about Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. I think he brings a very unique profile to the ticket, given his amazing wife, former Representative Gabby Giffords, and all their work around preventing gun violence, and also the fact that he has this as an engineer. I always get giddy about astronauts, and I think a lot of people do. I mean, as astronaut as a profession is a very cool profession that even as little kids, people look up to and aspire to. And so he's got that going for him too. So not just, Midwest, I think there are a lot of good options out there. And I'll say this is probably the first time I can recall where we have had this many good options. It hasn't always been like this. We did lose a lot of state legislatures. We lost a lot of governors in recent past, but we have really built up a strong bench on the Democratic side of state level leaders and folks in the Senate and the House who can move up and serve as that farm team. That's a testament to a lot of people on the ground and in these associations that have worked on that for the last decade. So it's a lot of good options out there. I think there are many that we cannot go wrong with.
That was Shana Roth and Alethea Casbin speaking with former state representative Adam Zemke. You can find episodes of WDET's State Politics podcasts at WDET.org or wherever you find your podcasts.
Coming up on the Metro, 50 years ago this month, the Supreme Court ruled against a desegregation plan for Detroit schools. The result has been continued segregation here in Detroit. We'll talk about the ruling and its consequences with a local journalist and historian coming up just next. You all stay right there. Welcome back to the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Around Detroit, some people complain about the schools, and when they do, they generally mention two things. The fact that they're segregated and they're underfunded. And there's a reason behind that. Many experts believe a 50-year-old Supreme Court ruling was the basis for the situation today.
Milliken v. Bradley is sort of like a nail in the coffin when it comes to these efforts to integrate schools, because basically the ruling is like, well, there is no racist intent behind the residential segregation that you see.
That was author and Grand Valley State Professor Leanne Kang. She studied the dramatic ways Detroit schools changed after Milliken versus Bradley. This month, that Supreme Court ruling turns 50. It overturned a district judge's ruling that would have desegregated Detroit schools by busing students from the suburbs into the city and vice versa. Now, after that ruling, busing in the name of integration could only happen within a district. So it limited any kind of meaningful effort to integrate schools. Detroit really needed the participation of suburban schools, which were mostly white back then. I reported on a story for Chalkbeat Detroit that looks back on that case and its impacts on us today. One of those consequences? Detroit schools are still really segregated, and this court ruling meant we lost the tools to do anything about it. One of the people I spoke with during my reporting is Detroit historian and journalist Ken Colman. He's written about the impacts of Milliken versus Bradley and the historical threads that led to the case, and we are lucky enough to have him in the studio now to discuss this topic. Ken Colman, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, could you talk about the historically racist practices like redlining that led to segregation in Detroit schools?
Sure. Well, it is. Thank you again for having me. It's a storied history that goes decades and decades prior to 2024. It goes back to the old Black Bottom and Paradise Valley days. It goes back to white neighborhood block clubs pushing back on African Americans moving into communities like the Old West Side. It goes back to the early 1960s. Well, it goes back to the 1950s and 60s when the local branch, Detroit NAACP, continually pushed back against the Detroit public schools, charging race discrimination. And it even, Robin, goes way back to the 1860s, late 1860s, with the Workman case, essentially the case by which racially integrated Detroit's public schools, people like Fannie Richards, an African-American school teacher, Detroit's first African-American school teacher, John Bagley, who was a school board member at that time, later became Detroit mayor and Michigan governor. And so continually cases that dealt with race discrimination in Detroit proper or in metropolitan Detroit have really been part of the mosaic, if you will, of southeastern Michigan history for decades and decades.
So the roots go really deep. Let's set the historical scene in Detroit leading up to this lower court's ruling that said students would have to be bused across districts to fix segregated classrooms in Detroit.
Yeah, it is essentially becomes a class action lawsuit involving the Detroit branch NAACP, suing both the Detroit public schools and the state of Michigan. It comes on the heels of a turbulent decade in our nation and in Detroit in the 1960s, where we, at least in our city, saw the Reverend Martin Luther King first give I Have a Dream speech in 1963 to the 1967 rebellion, and we spent a lot of time over the last week or so talking about it. And then finally, at the end of the decade, Milliken versus Bradley. And Bradley is an African-American child, Ronald Bradley, and he becomes the key plaintiff in this huge case that speaks to what the NAACP argued was racial inequities in education, not only being carried out in the budgets, the per pupil allotment, which is one of those geeky government terms. How many thousands of dollars are associated with each child? It goes to that, but not only that. Access, access in the physical look and feel of institutions like schools and administrative offices and the like. And so Milliken versus Bradley dealt with all that. And you had, interestingly enough, a John F. Kennedy appointed federal court judge, and Stephen Roth, who said at one point, just weeks before his death, he said at one point, I am ruling that we need to have cross-district busing throughout 54 communities in southeastern Michigan, which was radical at the time. And was something that there was a lot of pushback against, not only in terms of members of Congress who represented Michigan, but even the sitting president, Richard Nixon.
Can you talk a little bit more about the resistance to that order and the different types of people who opposed it here in Detroit?
Yeah, well, it certainly went mainly to racial lines, but not only racial lines. As Robin, as you and I have talked about in previous interviews leading up to this one, it just wasn't necessarily whites who were against this cross-district busing.
Right.
Also some African Americans, and a name that a lot of us will remember, Coleman Alexander Young, who was a Michigan state senator. And when he was a state senator, entered a bill that would create more local control in Detroit school districts. He did that as a Michigan state senator in 1969. 5 years later, when he was the sitting mayor, he actually opposed the NAACP's effort to enter into cross-district busing. People like Coleman Young felt, as African Americans, we're not interested in sitting next to white people. White kids, black kids sitting next to white kids. What we want are the same resources that they get in their suburban communities. And so that was a sort of push and pull, even in the black community. The NAACP wanted something a little different. Remember, they were part of Brown versus the Board in Topeka, Kansas, a decade before, almost a decade and a half before. So they had some different ideas. Detroit was becoming more African American, a majority African American city by 1974. And so there were different viewpoints, a Black Power movement that came after the traditional civil rights movement. And so there were different views, even in the communities of color, about how to carry out what Judge Roth wanted to see.
We're speaking with Ken Colman, a Detroit historian and journalist, about an impactful Supreme Court ruling that turns 50 this month, Milliken versus Bradley. I want to discuss something you said to me previously, Ken, and that is that Detroit is a city that's brought the nation various political movements. Could we veer off for a minute to acknowledge Detroit's rich history as this fertile ground for social movements?
Well, there's no doubt. Michigan or Detroit was one of the early NAACP branches. The national movement was founded in 1909. 3 years later, the Detroit branch was started. Detroit is also the home of the Nation of Islam, and a black sect of the Islamic religion, led largely by people like Elijah Muhammad for many decades. So Detroit is sort of a founding city to that. The Shrine of the Black Madonna. The Pan-African Christian Church, led by and founded by the Reverend Albert B. Clegg Jr., was another certainly part of the Black Power movement in Detroit. And so you saw throughout the 20th century all these movements, which quite frankly, Robin, helped to create the thoughts and the divergence, and particularly in African-American thought, about how to best find ways to educate children. Is it that we want our kids to go to school with white kids? Do we want kids in Black Bottom to go to school with kids in Northeast Detroit and Northwest Detroit, which, in the 30s and 40s and 50s were largely white? Or do we want the same resources? The Detroit Board of Education in the 1930s effectively created a de facto a black high school in Miller High School. They converted, first of all, talk about inequities. They converted, first of all, a junior high school that was not built for high school kids. They created that school, and that created a whole set of inequities. And so we had a whole myriad of those inequities in our city.
That was Detroit historian and journalist Ken Colman talking to us about the impacts of the Supreme Court case Milliken versus Bradley. The case turns 50 this month.
Excuse me, almost. Ken, thank you so much for being on the show with us. We're going to have you back and would love to hear the conversation continue between you and Robin. So hopefully we can get a recorded conversation and hear the rest of that conversation. Thank you, Ken. That's the Metro for Monday, July 29th. You can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. The show is also on YouTube if you like listening that way.
The show is produced by Sam Corey, David Leans, and Jack Philbrandt. Additional production support from Anel Scott and Sydney Walkley. Our engineer is Nate Bender. Music by Sam Bobian and Will Sessions.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Thanks for listening, and myself and Rob and Vincent will see you tomorrow.
See you then.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new master's degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. More information at business.udmercy.edu.